Hey Florinas, welcome back to Reformation Rambles, a series where I tell you all about the history of the European Reformation. Today we're going to be talking about a feminist icon, one of the first women to hold real power in Europe. Born in 1451 to John II of Castile and Isabella of Portugal in Madrigal, let's talk about Isabella of Castile. Now, when she was born, she was second in line to the throne after her brother Henry. And a couple of years later, her brother Alfonso was born, and that moved her to third in line. In 1454, Henry would take the throne, becoming Henry IV of Castile. And this was obviously after her dad died, which meant she then fell under her half-brother Henry's care. So her and her brother Alfonso were moved to Aravea, and their living conditions there were not great. Even though Isabella's dad had put aside money specifically for them, it was stated in his will that they should be cared for really well by Henry. Henry just kind of ignored that. They had shortages of money in Aravea. They weren't like peasants, like they had enough to get by, but they were struggling a lot more than any royals generally do. But yeah, I feel like it's a common misconception, and part of that's because of how it's been portrayed through Isabella's lens, that they basically were peasants for a while, and they weren't. They just weren't. Sorry. So Isabella was educated in this time, further evidence that they weren't treated like peasants, and over time she would say this taught her a practical piety, a deep reverence for religion. So when Henry's wife was giving birth to their daughter Joanna, Isabella and Alfonso were summoned to Segovia. This was to finish their education. So Isabella was placed in the Queen's household, to learn lady stuff. It's the 1400s, they're not very progressive, I'm sorry. Things were much better in Segovia. They had plenty of food, plenty of clothing. They lived in a literal castle, so moving on up for some. So then, from then on, Isabella was given like the standard royal education. So for women, this would be, I'm reading quite a few things. Reading, writing, history, maths, art, chess, dancing, embroidery, music, and religious instruction. Something that will become important later in this tale is that Isabella was forbidden to leave Segovia during this time. Most people think this is Henry trying to protect her from political turmoil across the kingdom during this time, but she knew about them anyway. Also, it seems kind of weird that he was protecting her now when he took away like a load of her money earlier. That's just my opinion. But yeah, not the worst upbringing overall. Which takes us to part 2. Succession Crisis 1.0. Noblemen in Castile weren't very happy at this time. They basically wanted a ruler they could control. So they wanted to make Henry make Alfonso the heir to the throne, rather than his child. So they would fight Henry's troops at the Second Battle of Olmedo in 1467. This ended in a draw, but Henry then agreed to make Alfonso the heir to the throne anyway, so that was a worthwhile war, lads, well done. However, to become heir, he had to marry his daughter, Joanna. Which didn't happen, because Alfonso died of the plague in 1468. Okay, it was probably the plague. A lot of nobles at the time thought he was poisoned. I don't think there's much evidence to point to that, but I mean, maybe there is and I just didn't come across it. So if you have more information about that, do let me know in the comments. I'm very interested. Regardless, this made Isabella the successor as far as the nobles were concerned, because Alfonso had said he wanted Isabella to be his successor. I know it's getting confusing. I feel like I need a diagram, but I'm not a graphic designer, so hope you're following. Sorry it's confusing. Succession generally is, because you need like half a family tree. So the nobles wanted her to champion the rebellion, oust Henry from the throne. Isabella was too smart for that. She knew support for the rebels was dropping off, and it wouldn't be a very secure throne if she took it that way. She met with Henry and they came to an agreement. Isabella was to be Henry's successor rather than his daughter. This included a marriage clause where Isabella wouldn't marry someone without Henry's consent, but Henry couldn't force Isabella to marry someone against her will. In 1465, he attempts to make Isabella marry Alfonso of Portugal, because an alliance with Portugal would be super beneficial. They're their next door neighbours, but Isabella was like, no, not marrying him, soz. Henry wasn't a good king, and it's important to know that. And by that I mean he wasn't a good king for the time period he was living in. When the civil war did break out, he needed to please the rebels or risk his throne. As a result, Isabella was betrothed to one of the leading rebels, Pedro Giron Asona Project, and I pronounced that wrong, I'll put that name on the screen. He was Master of the Order of Calatrava. This was like a Castilian military order. And Isabella didn't want to marry him. By this point, Henry's acknowledging the agreement they made less and less. Like, she's a woman, she has to marry someone, it's 1400s. So he's trying to force this to go ahead, and Isabella is praying and praying that this marriage doesn't happen. And in something that probably to her felt like divine intervention, Pedro died en route to meet his fiancée, Isabella. Now, I don't believe in a higher power, but I can see how this would reinforce a belief you already had. Fast forward to 1468, and Alfonso of Portugal offered to marry Isabella again. He was really keen to have this go ahead. And Henry, by this point, is just pushing to make it happen. Regardless of the fact Isabella had already rejected him, he's like, no, we're going ahead, this is going to happen. You know, classic 15th century women's rights. But Isabella was not having it. She made a secret plan. The plan was to marry her cousin. History, am I right? I feel like I need an incest alarm for this series because something happens every episode. Her cousin was Ferdinand of Aragon. Ferdinand's father, who was the King of Aragon at the time, organised this secret wedding. Because they were cousins, they needed the Pope to basically say it was okay, to say they were allowed to get married. Because I guess God's fine with incest in some situations. Adam and Eve, am I right? I don't know anything about the Bible beyond like what I know about history, so feel free to rip me to shreds if I'm getting shit wrong, okay? Now, so they got this papal dispensation, this permission from the Pope, and it was signed by a Pope who'd been dead for 6 years. They had not been organising this for 6 years. It was forged, probably by Alexandre Borgia, but we don't know. They wouldn't get proper papal dispensation until 2 years after they were married, because their pal became Pope. It just beggars belief, doesn't it? So, like I'd said before, Isabella wasn't allowed to leave without like permission, so she asked Henry if she could go visit her brother Alfonso's grave in Valladolid, and he said yes, because obviously that's a good look for a future queen, you know, mourning her dead brother, I guess. What else are you going to do? It's the 1400s, and you gotta have a pastime. Lots of people were dying. It's just been a plague, guys. Yeah, she said she was going to go visit Alfonso's grave. Sorry, I misspoke before. That wasn't in Valladolid. She kind of went towards the grave and then rewrote it to Valladolid, where she was going to go meet Ferdinand to have a secret wedding. Ferdinand entered Valladolid disguised as a servant, and his like people who were also disguised as servants actually had rocks thrown at them. One narrowly avoided like just cannoning him in the head, and he'd have just probably died. Married on the 18th of October 1469. Henry wasn't happy, obviously, but what could he do? He didn't have the power to like break them up. He couldn't annul the marriage. So fast forward to 1474. Henry dies and Isabella knows troubles are brewing, so she hides out in the Alcazar of Segovia, and the next day she's proclaimed Queen of Castile and Leon. Some people were delighted and some people were pissed. Isn't that always the way? They thought Joanna, Henry's daughter, was the rightful heir, but then the other side had heard rumours that Henry was actually gay and Joanna wasn't his real daughter, so Isabella was obviously the rightful heir. So what happens when powerful people disagree? That's right, another civil war. So the Marquis of Vienna and his followers are all on Joanna's side. They think she'd be easier controlled, they're probably right, which would be better for them. To begin with, the Archbishop of Toledo, who was the person who had actually married Isabella and Ferdinand just 5 years earlier, was on Isabella's side. And he defected and fucked off to plot with the Marquis of Vienna, because of course he did. Don't trust rich people. That's my takeaway. Don't trust rich people. These people make a plan for Joanna to marry the guy that Isabella rejected, Alfonso of Portugal. The idea was he would run Castile for her because a woman can't possibly run a country. So like I said, this would become all-out civil war. In May 1475, Alfonso and his entire army went to Castile, where he married Joanna, which kick-started a long and bloody war of succession. In 1476, the Battle of Taro took place, after which both sides claimed and celebrated victory. Oh, the confidence. Big mood though. Despite this, it is just remembered as a win for Castile, not Portugal. After it, Joanna's followers disbanded, and this was largely because Isabella and Ferdinand just went all over the country declaring that they'd won, that they'd defeated Portugal spectacularly, and then the word got back to Portuguese troops who were like, well, guess it's over, guys. It's literally fake it till you make it, and it worked. Portuguese army left Castile with no allies. Isabella went to the courts of Madrigal Segovia and listed her daughter as heir to the throne. Joanna was sent to a convent in Portugal, where she'd spend the rest of her life. And then in 1479, Ferdinand became King of Aragon, making Isabella the first queen of most of Spain. The first real thing where there was sort of a united Spain, but the kingdoms would technically be separate until the 1700s. So, like, it's not become Spain, it's still Castile and Aragon, to be clear. Part 3. Controlling chaos. Just because they'd won didn't mean everything was magically fine. People weren't happy about them being in power, and they had taken control of a disaster. Basically, the country at the time is more of a chaotic mess than I am. Rebellion broke out in Segovia in August of 1476, and Isabella personally rode for weeks to negotiate with the rebels, even though all her advisors had told her she shouldn't do that. The throne wasn't really secured until she had her son Juan in 1478. As well as people not supporting the Queen, Henry had fucked the country. Henry had done basically nothing to enforce any of the laws. It was said that under his rule, murder, rape and robbery happened without punishment. Isabella imposed new measures to fix this. In fact, she was seen as less forgiving in most of these situations than her husband's. And it's written in almost every book about Isabella that she was more inclined to justice than mercy. She changed this in a few ways. At the Cortes of Madrigal in 1476, she introduced La Santa Hermandad, which was essentially a police force. Now, these had existed and been used before, but never by the crown, more like rogue vigilante groups. And now they were to be funded by taxes. In 1477, Isabella visited Extremadura and Andalusia to improve policing there. And in 1481, she sent 2 officials to keep the peace in Galicia, which was the source of the majority of the uprisings against her, and it worked. Henry had also left Castile in a bunch of debt. Essentially, he'd sold off royal estates for way less than they were worth, get money really quickly, because obviously they'd sell fast. So in 1480 at the Cortes of Toledo, Isabella had an inquiry started around these properties. It was decided that those that weren't given in exchange for services were to be returned to the crown for no compensation, and some were brought back for the low price they were bought for. There were exceptions. If any were gifts for churches, hospitals, the poor, they wouldn't be reclaimed. Another issue that was happening financially to the country was that coins had been minted really excessively under Henry's rule. This had led to insane inflation, so Isabella established a royal monopoly over mints and provided an actual legal standard for coins, so you can just smash one out and be like, done, got money now, yeah. Isabella completely changed how the government ran, but she didn't really do this by creating new government institutions. She just reformed the ones that already existed. So when I say they, I mean Isabella and Ferdinand, because they were essentially joint rulers. Can't just say Isabella did something because her husband did as well. So when I say they, I mean the pair of them. Okay, so they reformed the Royal Council, giving it full power to resolve any legal or political issues, as well as financial reform. At the Cortes of Toledo, she also made her government up of more lower nobility than the traditional nobility who had traditionally just inherited these roles. She replaced them with letrados, or lawyers. These were just educated people. It was moving more towards a meritocracy than just an aristocracy, which is not really seen anywhere else at the time in Europe. It's very much like these people who were qualified were getting these jobs instead of just their dad had the job before them. Educated individuals were obviously more equipped to run a country, really. So the councils came to be made up of one bishop, 3 caballeros or knights, were still in medieval times, and 8 or 9 letrados. So traditional nobles were allowed to come watch, but they couldn't join in. As well as this, Isabella and Ferdinand had time set aside every Friday for subjects to come to them with complaints, and this was a new thing. Most royals at the time didn't give a shit what their people thought, and even the ones that didn't often speak with the lower classes that was seen as beneath them. So TLDR, she reorganised the government and made moves towards a fairer society. She significantly reduced the crime rate and reduced the enormous debts her brother left. And none of this is what you'll read about Isabella in most books. So part 4, religious unity. Like with all of these videos, it's not just incredible progress. I'm not trying to talk down the progress. I think it's important to give you the full story. So let's talk about why Ferdinand and Isabella are known as the Catholic kings. So under Isabella, the Spanish Inquisition became a full-on institution. I've made a video about the Inquisition. I could make a lot of videos about it in detail. Oh my lord, so much happens. But to summarise, this was created to root out heresy. Specifically, it targeted conversos, which was people who had converted, often through force, from Judaism to Christianity. It was brutal, and a lot of people were needlessly executed. Watch the video. But in summary, it's bad, and it's a major part of Isabella's legacy. She would appoint the first Inquisitor General, Thomas de Torquemada, and the ultimate aim was religious unity, to aid in the sort of national unity of these two kingdoms. In 1492, they would expel the Jews. All Jewish people in Spain, given 4 months to leave or convert to Christianity. If they left, they couldn't take gold, silver, or horses. At the time, they claimed 200,000 people left Spain. But it looks like there were only 80,000 Jews in Spain at the time, and only about 40,000 left. The other half just converted, because you can't just up and leave with no money or help. It was literally go away, and they're like, where though? We've lived here forever. Now, those who converted, many would come under the suspicion of the Inquisition. Regardless, this expulsion would destroy Aragon industry-wise. A lot of their workers, a lot of their wealth were Jewish people. Cities like Barcelona were referred to as ghost towns. But at least everyone's Catholic, right? I love history, but I hate history. In 1502, Isabella would break the Treaty of Granada, more on that in a minute, and expelled any Muslims who wouldn't convert to Christianity. Which moves us on to part 5, taking on the world. The Treaty of Granada was a product of Ferdinand and Isabella completing Reconquista. With the conquest of Granada, now again, could make a whole video on this, but in short, Granada had been held by the Muslim Nasrid dynasty for basically as long as anyone alive could remember. And in 1482, the Catholic monarchs began their attack on this kingdom. They recruited soldiers from all across Europe and had really the most up-to-date cannons and stuff, really up-to-date weaponry, and they were really systemic. They essentially conquered Granada piece by piece over a few years. So in 1492, Granada fell to Isabella and her husband. Immediately, the principal mosque was turned into a church. What's respect for different cultures? The 1400s sure as shit don't know. Anyway, the Treaty of Granada was signed, which permitted Jews and Muslims to live in Granada in peace, which as we now know would be broken in 1502. Famously, Isabella sponsored Christopher Columbus's trip to the West Indies. He returned with a lot of gold for Spain and would be paid for his efforts in 1493. And this kick-started Spain's golden age of exploration and colonisation. In 1494, the Treaty of Tordesillas was signed with Portugal, saying basically that they'd share all non-European places, basically implying that anywhere outside of Europe belonged to Portugal and Spain. Just literally, it's ours now. Now, Isabella was against the enslavement of Native Americans. because as far as she was concerned, they were now subjects of the Castilian crown. And to sort of back this up, when Columbus captured 1,200 men, Isabella ordered his arrest and just hired different conquerors. In 1500, she officially granted all non-rebellious natives in the colonies citizenship and full freedom. In her own words, if they have received any wrong, remedy it. Now, taking countries is still bad. Obviously, don't get me wrong here. I just think it's interesting to point out how this original viewpoint was changed over time. I'm not saying she was wonderful and lovely to Native Americans. I'm really not. Please don't misunderstand that. So under Isabella's reign, Spain became this major European power. Seville would monopolise trade with the New World for 2 centuries to come, and Pope Alexander VI granted Spain full control of the New World. God said colonialism's fine, basically. Finally, part 6, Succession Crisis 2.0. Now it all seemed like after Isabella's death, succession would be easy. She had a male heir, what could go wrong? Well, in 1497, her son Juan died. A year later, in 1498, her eldest daughter would die in childbirth. Now, Isabella still had 3 daughters. The youngest, Catherine of Aragon, would marry into England. The middle daughter, Maria, would marry Portugal. And the crown would go to her eldest daughter, who, funny enough, was called Joanna. Isabella withdrew from government in September of 1504 and would die in November of that year. Ferdinand wanted the throne, but Castile was not having that. Because as far as they were concerned, he was a foreign ruler. He wasn't in line to the throne, he just married into it. And again, there was all-out civil war. Eventually, Joanna would take the throne, only to be locked away due to mental illness. I've talked about that in more detail in this video here. Isabella's legacy is extensive. She essentially rewrote history books, which doesn't help us to find the truth, as good a story as most of them read, but she was canonized by the church in 1958. 17 experts went through all the archive, 3,500 documents totaling over 27 volumes were looked through, and they determined she was exemplary in all acts of virtue and fear of God. So in 1974 she was officially named a servant of God by the Catholic Church because, and I quote, "There was not found one single act, public or private, Queen Isabella, that was not inspired by Christian and evangelical criteria." She very much shaped her own image, full of sanctity, and as the founder of the Spanish Empire. In 1815, the Order of Isabella the Catholic was created by the Spanish Crown, and she was the first woman on US postage stamps, although this was alongside Columbus. I really hope you've enjoyed this. If you did, please give me a cheeky like and subscribe, and let me know in the comments if I touched on anything you'd like to know more about. Maybe you want to know more about the Inquisition or Granada. Both are really interesting. And I'll see you guys next week. Bye. Hi Frankie, you want to click clack louder?